Hello, everyone. My name is Anya, and today I have with me Vanshika. And we'll be talking about the need for United Nations reforms and how it can be reformed. And we'll be focusing mainly on the United Nations Security Council, with it being one of the most prominent bodies under the United Nations. So, Vanshika, can you tell me a bit about the history of the United Nations and how that connects to this call for the United Nations reforms?
Firstly, thank you, Anya, for giving me this opportunity. Now, talking about the history of the United Nations, so it was a body which was, formed in 1945 after the end of the Second World War, right? Now, a body which initially had around 51 members to a body, which now has more than 190 plus members is the sole reason as to why, reforms are necessary in this organization. Now, when we talk about the global landscape, in 1945, the global landscape was very different as to what it is today. You had countries such as India, which were a colony of the British, and China, was not a major power back then. And from 1945 to 2024, there have been a lot of changes. For instance, the Cold War has ended, and in today's time you have some most serious issues such as the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine, which call for the attention of the United Nations. And
Yeah.
when we talk about the reforms which are needed in this organization. So, firstly, I feel that Anya, this body lacks democracy and representation of the major nations. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Vanshika, I very, agree with what you said. Like, when you think about it, as you rightly pointed, the United Nations was formed in 1945, a post-colonial relic. And it was formed with the intention to stop wars because the world had been ravaged by the World War II that time. So the sole intention of United Nations was to stop war, and the United Nations unfortunately has not succeeded in it. The world at present is marred with conflicts everywhere. Like you pointed, the Ukraine war, the Israel-Palestine situation, or just anywhere. There are conflicts. There are uh, so all these things which call for United Nations reforms. And when we get to the point of representation and democracy, Vanshika, that is not there. So first, let's understand about the structure of the United Nations Security Council and how stuff happens there. I think by understanding that, we can better know why reforms are necessary, right? So the
Right.
United Nations Security Council. It's a group of only 15 people, 15 countries, sorry, out of which 10 are elected for a period of 2 years, and the rest five are permanent members who have been there since very long, right? So those countries are United States, Russia, China, UK, and France. Now, pay attention to this thing that they only constitute for about 28% of the world's population. So you can think of it as only 28% of the world's population deciding everything for the rest of the world. And out of that 28%, China takes up more than half of it, because China's at present the world's second largest country by population, right? And when you think of Asia, which is the world's largest continent with the highest population, it has about 60% of the world population. That is only represented by China, no other country. Africa has no representation. Countries of the Latin America have no representation. This And then we have the veto. I think, Vanshika, it's one of the most unjust and unfair things. It's like you take a hammer, you serve democracy on a plate, and you smash the hammer on it repeatedly. So what are your thoughts about veto and what happens?
Yes, Anya. You rightly pointed about the P5 countries that how they account only for 28% of the world's population. And these five countries were chosen to be the permanent members because they emerged the victors after the end of the Second World War.
Yeah,
But now the situation has changed a lot. And the veto power which is enjoyed by these countries is not truly democratic, and it's not a fair system. Now, when we talk about the veto power, what the veto power is, Anya, is that it's simply to vote in a negative way. Now, this power, sorry, which is enjoyed by these five countries, is very outdated, I believe. And
yeah,
countries have used veto power in the past, and they continue to use it for their own selfish interests. For example, China prevented sanctions against Pakistan based terrorists. And very recently, and this was something which I was reading in the newspaper yesterday, that Russia will support North Korea. So imagine if North Korea launches attack against South Korea, so Russia will be backing up North Korea against it, right? And
yeah,
when you think about this, Russia is a veto member. And I believe that veto members should be conscious, and they should serve the interests of the entire global community as to supporting the countries or supporting nations with whom they have ties with. So this is as the sole reason as to why that there should be an expansion as well in the United Nations Security Council, which you mentioned rightly. And as we believe that countries such as India and Japan, all of them all of them deserve to be a member of the
yeah.
United Nations Security Council.
Yeah. Vanshika, like I do call for an expansion of the United Nations Security Council, but I also call for reform. Because even if we have, say 10 more veto wielding countries, will it change the fact that just one country, in itself can overrule the collective decision, the collective votes of all other countries? Countries which have been elected by the members of the United Nations to the United Nations Security Council. So, like I said, it's like smashing the voice of democracy. So there needs to be some reforms in the in the veto thing as well. Like maybe you can have it as if three countries veto this, then the resolution will not pass. Because giving just one country that power in the world where we are right now, in a multipolar world which calls for democracy, which calls for equality, is very unjust. So, like, what do you think of it?
Yeah, rightly said, Anya, that there should be expansion in the United Nations Security Council, as well as reforms are also very necessary. Because you have countries such as Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India, all of them which are also a part of the G4.
Yeah,
And these countries do aspire to become permanent members of the UNSC. And this is very well supported by the fact that these countries are the growing economies today. Now India is the fastest growing economy. And when we solely talk about India's contributions to the United Nations, so India has included Africa in the G20 summit, the African Union.
yeah,
And when we also talk about its contributions, right, to the peacekeeping operations, so India has served as the largest contributor to the UN's peacekeeping operations as well. And India is not a selfish country. India aspires aspires for the progress and for the development of every nation. And I believe that India's membership would ensure a very inclusive and a multipolar world.
yeah.
So what do you think, Anya?
So, like you pointed about the G20, right? The G20 was formed in 1999. So, despite being formed in 1999, the G20 included African Union under India's presidency. BRICS, which is a thing of the 21st century. uh, it included these newer countries, right? I think at present there are 10 or 11 BRICS countries now after it expanded. So when these organizations, which are so new, which are, have just started functioning, have just started giving results, why can't the United Nations, which was formed like around 80 years before, which comes with it, which brings with it a legacy, the funding, everything. Why can't the United Nations reform? It can, right? So that is an important thing.
Right.
As you have pointed about the G4, there are the G4 countries, then there are the L69 group of countries as well, right? Which includes developing countries from Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific. And I think India is also a part of it, right? So I think these small countries, these developing nations, they own the brunt of the developed nations. Like uh, I was reading about this thing, climate change contributions. The developed countries have, as of now, in the past 200 or 300 years, have contributed the most to climate change in a negative manner, right? But these smaller countries bear the brunt of it. Like Kiribati is on the is like on the extent of going under the sea water level, right? There's the Maldives as well. So when the effect on these smaller countries are the most, and that is why of anything, and that is why reforms to include these smaller countries, these countries which matter in the United Nations in the discussion of, what happens is important, right? And as you have pointed about India, Germany, Brazil, Japan, there's no denying that because I think they deserve it, right? Germany, Japan, and India are three of the world's largest economies, right? At number three, four, and five. India is the world's fastest growing economy as well, right? With the world's most population. So that is there. So L69 demands for additional six seats as permanent members, right? Uh, which will include the African group as well, the CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, and the group of four, which is a very, I think, a good step, right? So, what do you think of this, Vanshika? Like, we talk about United Nations Security Council and its reforms, but like, do you think in the overall uh, things, like when you include the entire United Nations, that there also needs some more representation, some more democracy in there?
Yes, Anya. When we talk about L69 and G4, all of this, at the end of the day points out to the need of, an increase in representation and diversity in the body, right? For instance, when we are talking about the increase in the membership of the nations or an expansion of the Security Council, I feel, there's also a need for a greater representation for youth, marginalized communities, and women.
Yeah,
Now, when we talk about the initiatives of the UN, does have a lot of youth programs which, demand for a greater role for the youth in development.
yeah, like
And,
the
we also
sustainable,
have the sustainable developmental goals.
yeah, what I was saying exactly.
Yeah, so we also have the sustainable developmental goals, which are known as the global goals, and the UN, plans to achieve them by 2030. Again, a very, a wonderful initiative as to, for the cooperation for the entire, global community as well.
Yeah,
And, when we talk about women, so Anya, I'm not aware if you know this, but, only 4 out of 73 UN secretaries were women. And it's a wonderful thing that Indian women such as Vijay Lakshmi Pandit was the UN Secretary General.
yeah, if I'm not wrong, she was the first ever
And
women secretary general, right? She was the
Sorry.
first ever women secretary general, which is a great thing, right?
Yeah. So all of this, again points out to the fact that we are it is important to incorporate diverse perspectives when you address global challenges. And when we talk about diversity also, so we have many regional organizations such as the African Union, ASEAN, and all of them have all of them they serve as the voice of their own regions. So what do you think about these regional bodies and their efforts when it comes to the United Nations?
Okay, yeah, Vanshika, that's a brilliant question. That's a very brilliant question, right? So, when you talk about regional organizations, I think they form the core of what United Nations is, because these regional organizations work with countries on the ground level. And then, so when you think that of a potential collaboration between regional bodies and the United Nations, you think of magic, because that would happen, right? Uh, so the expertise of the United Nations, the funding of which comes with it, and the ground level work of the regional bodies, right? Like African Union or ASEAN or or any other regional body. I think there needs to be more collaborative efforts between them. There needs to be more dialogue. There needs to be more representation of even smaller countries, which I was talking about, through these regional bodies can happen. And I think that would be a great thing, because then there will be, like we have called for in this entire podcast, greater representation, more diversity, and the voices of all will be heard. And it's very important that the voices of all are heard, right? So yeah, that's what I think about the regional organizations and United Nations cooperation. It will be, I think it will be very effective, right? So, uh, you know, Vanshika, we have discussed quite a bit, right, in this meeting about United Nations reforms. Can you tell me, like, your, a conclusive opinion on it? What do you think, like, can be done and how?
Yes, so from our conversation, Anya, the first thing which comes to my mind is that, there's a need to reform the United Nations and there's an urgency for the reforms. Now, also,
Yeah.
when we talk about the challenges which we face in today's world, these challenges are very unconventional. For instance, we have in today's time, we have global pandemics, we have, challenges such as terrorism, and all of them cannot be solved by one country, and rather they require the cooperation and collaboration of all the countries as well. So in order to ensure that the UN is a relevant body,
Yeah.
to ensure that it serves the interest of the entire global community, reforms are very much needed, and particularly in the United Nations Security Council, as we have discussed before. So yeah, that would be my take on that.
So, Vanshika, you spoke about
And
the pandemics, right? That just reminds me of the work that was done by WHO during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how it is a perfect example of cooperation, right? All countries came together, right? India contributed a lot there, and we could overcome that crisis only by cooperation, only by representation, right? Because everyone was cared for. I think that's the essence of what the United Nations should be, right? So yeah.
yes, Anya, and I think with that note, we should, end our conversation. And we hope that, we were able to provide our listeners with a interesting take on the United Nations reforms. And I would, thank you for joining me today.
Yes. No, actually, I express my gratitude to you. This was a really enriching conversation. So we'll be back with another episode of the Geopods soon, hopefully on a on a topic that's more entertaining. Stay tuned till then. Thank you.